Welcome to Studio C70 at the Committee of 70. Next month is Election Day, big primary for the city of Philadelphia, judicial offices on the ballot, and a whole host of city offices, mayor, city council, but also city commissioner, register of wills, sheriff, whole bunch of offices. We'll come back at the end of the interview here to talk about a couple resources you might use. For now, though, with this election, elections are like job interviews. The candidates are like the job applicants. The voters are like the hiring committee. We have one of the job applicants for city commissioner with us this morning.
Absolutely.
Kahlil Williams, how are you, sir?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here.
Very
So
good
we
to be
only
here.
have 15 minutes.
Okay.
And so let's dig right in. City commissioner is not the highest profile office in the city, and kind of unique
Sure.
as far as election offices across the country. It's actually one of the very few in the United States where it's an elected position that's only responsible for overseeing elections.
That's right.
Could you talk a little bit about like how you see this job and why you're running for it?
Sure, absolutely. So let me just start with the first question first, of how I see this job. So I think that this is it's an underutilized position. It's a position that for a very long time has been a place where people are staffed or run for because they are in a patronage mill, essentially, or people that are not particularly interested in how elections are governed. It's been sort of afterthought of government, and I think that it really shouldn't be. And so I see the job as a number of things. I see it one as, I mean, it is primarily an election administration function, right? So the goal is to run elections well, is to run elections properly, is to make sure that things don't happen on election day. It shouldn't happen, but it can be much more than that. I think there's lots of space there for public information. I think there's lots of space there for election reform advocacy, and I think there's a lot of room for sort of expansion of the duties of an office that really is meant to engage with the public. I mean, I think it could be everything from a cheerleader for the city in terms of why people should participate in the process and what's going on in the city that people should care about, but also to the election reform point. As part of why I'm running is because I think it should be a position that is pushing the ball forward on any number of election reforms, and that's from from redistricting that's going to be coming up this cycle to some of the election reform changes that I want to see, which is same-day voting, early voting, no-fault absentee ballots, and those types of things. And so I think the commissioner's office should be taking positions on that. They haven't typically, and I think that we should be pushing and organizing everyone from other county boards here in the state to individuals and organizations in Philadelphia and elsewhere to push those election reforms forward.
And let's talk about you just for a minute. Can you talk about like your background and record? I know that elections are not a brand new thing to you.
Sure.
You've worked on them before. So like, how does that experience translate into being a city commissioner?
I think it does. I think it does quite well. So just a couple things about me. I am an attorney here in the city, the only lawyer that's actually running for city commissioner. But before I went to law school, I worked for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund on helping to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. And so that's something that's given me a passion for this sort of work. I think it's given me an attention and a focus on elections and sort of how they're run, how they're protected, and making sure that people have the right to vote. After I worked for LDF, I went to a place called the Brennan Center for Justice and worked there for a couple of years. And so when I talked about the election reforms that I'd like to see, a lot of that advocacy work is stuff that I did before I went to law school. And so I worked on redistricting reform, which was super interesting and is I think coming more in vogue here in Pennsylvania after the sort of fiasco with the redistricting battles the last couple of years. Worked on some campaign finance reform stuff. Philadelphia actually has pretty comparatively good campaign finance reform or campaign finance legislation, although I think that public finances is something that people should be talking about. And I think and I worked on some stuff with restoring the right to vote for people with felony convictions, which was really exciting and gives you some opportunities to build sort of unlikely coalitions within both within government, people that in different sort of groups that are really interested in making sure that people have a second chance and that people can be redeemed through the criminal justice system, and that includes the getting the right to vote back. So that stuff I did before law school. I think that being a lawyer and understanding the rules of the road is helpful. It's one of the reasons I drove to law school, but I sort of went to law school with an eye towards doing this sort of stuff, at least in my pro bono practice, if not my full-time practice, which is sort of pushing election reform, doing things involving free and fair elections.
So you mentioned a couple of election reforms that that would have to be legislated in Harrisburg.
Sure.
And for folks at home, there are 3 city commissioners. They serve together on the County Board of Elections, which is a bipartisan body. Every county in the Commonwealth has this bipartisan County Board of Elections. Obviously, bipartisan is that there's some bit of balance there and providing a proper oversight. Well, I guess my question is, to advocate for certain election reforms as a Democrat or as a Republican in Harrisburg, how do you strike that balance in making sure that the commissioners don't get caught up in a partisan effort?
Right. Well, this is kind of what is unfortunate about election reforms. It really shouldn't be a partisan issue, and to the degree that some folks see. I know Mitch McConnell talking about having election day on a holiday is a power grab. I just don't think that's true. And so to the degree that that there are certain policies that affect Democrats because of how they sort of think about the process, I really think it should be access for everyone is better. I think that making elections easier for people to participate in is something that everyone should seek. There are Republicans that are shift workers that would prefer to have voting on more than one day. There are Democrats that live in a different part of the city than where they work and would prefer to have a no-fault absentee ballot option. And so Martina White, for instance, had really nice commentary in an article that came out back in October that talks about how first responders, a large portion of whom live in the Northeast, how those folks are disenfranchised in some ways because there are people that work as maybe stationed some part in some other part of the city is far from where they live, and they're working 16-hour jobs or they've got to be on site for some long period of time, and they're deciding about whether or not to work or to vote, right? And that's not the type of thing you want to have. And I don't think that all those people are Democrats. I'm sure that there are a fair number of Republicans, and I think that her talking about the fact that we should get something done to help these folks is something that I'm in favor of, and I think there are lots of bipartisan sort of issues out there that I think everyone can agree upon.
So let's talk about one of the more high-profile issues that's come up this year. I mean, election integrity has always been a concern for the Committee of 70 and for Philadelphia and for the state of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia in particular has had an interesting history, I guess, around elections. And back when 70 was first established, one of our first orders of business was to run election protection work and crack down on the voter fraud that was like fairly rampant 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Today our security issues are a bit different. I mean, the election fraud that that we hear about and that we see is quite isolated, very sporadic, and limited to inter-party contests. But obviously there's been some controversy around the voting machines, and there are certainly larger national and international implications around election security now. So the commissioners did vote on a new system. Can you talk about what you think about that particular choice, the process around it, and what do you think we need to do to guarantee a secure election in this town?
Sure. So there's a lot there. Let me try to unpack and I'll start with the process, right? So I was made aware of this. I think in part because I happened to be running for office, and the way that this happened was there was essentially a settlement between the state and plaintiffs in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania sometime in late November. And that, I think, triggered an RFP being sent out by the city for new election machines, because the settlement essentially said that Pennsylvania is agreeing to have certain types of election machines, i.e. machines that have a voter verified paper trail that's auditable in advance of elections in the spring of 2020, right? And so I think that I sort of rushed to get the RFP out was not particularly well publicized. I think people were sort of caught off guard, and I recall not knowing anything about really the RFP until January, when the commissioners asked for public comment. The public comment was sent out maybe 2 or 3 days before it actually occurred, at least for the Thursday day, and then I guess maybe 4 or 5 days before the Saturday event. The commissioners did not reply to people that had that expressed concern about everything from hand-marked paper ballots to the fact that the process was being rushed through, and that they had this sort of February drop deadline for choosing the machines. And I think that actually did take away from a lot of things. I think it took away from the ability to have a robust conversation. I mean, we obviously know that there was no demonstration of election machines among the public before these things were voted upon, which other counties are doing. Montgomery County is doing that, Delaware County is doing it, Allegheny County is doing demonstrations, and they're having a much more deliberate process, right? And so that's not the process that we ended up with. I still don't understand why that didn't happen, and I'm not sure the commissioners have been really clear about why we had to have a process that was so rushed.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the election security part, I think the machines that we picked, people are rightly concerned about the fact that they are more susceptible or vulnerable to interference than hammer or paper ballots are. I think the commissioner's counter is that these machines are better for folks that are disabled and better for other types of populations that don't require people to vote on a separate system. And so those are balancing acts you have to do with any machine. But I do think that given that we have a president that has sort of refused to acknowledge Russian interference. The fact that the Mueller report essentially said that the Russians were trying adamantly to try to interfere with elections. I mean, I think it's something that we have to be concerned about. And I think that if there are places for them to interfere, I think Pennsylvania might be a good place to start because of how the role we're going to play in the electoral college.
Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna throw out another kind of big old question at you. Let's say you are one of the next city commissioners. These are 4-year terms. What's a big thing that you'd want to get done in that time?
Absolutely. So I think there are a number of things that I think I'm really focused on. So I think the city commissioner's office, the reason you talked about it being not particularly high profile, and I think that's true. And one of the reasons is that we need to be, I think, in communities more frequently. And so one of the things that I hope we can do is start holding meetings in different parts of the city. And so right now the meetings are usually held either in City Hall or they're held Delaware and Spring Garden. And I think taking the office to the people is something that we've really got to be focused on. So that's having meetings in the far Northwest, right? It's having meetings in Southwest Pete. It's having meetings in the Northeast. Like the getting out into the communities, I think, is important. And I know that there have been questions that have been put to us about sort of how we want to do, sort of make sure that we have sort of focused and strategic efforts to increase turnout and get more people involved. I think we need to be taking a hard look at the data. I mean, registration data is not hard to parse. Voter turnout is not hard to parse, and we need to be thinking really, really focused on making sure that the resources from our office are also getting to the people that really need it, the people in low turnout wards, the folks that do not understand why participation is helpful, and so it is not, and making something that serves the city a little more fully. To the point about election reform, I think if the office is putting out policy positions and talking to people, engaging people more on election reforms, I think that's a great start. A little bit harder to measure, but something that I'm really interested in doing. And something I've been talking about on the campaign trail, which I'm really focused on, is ballot randomization. And so I think that's something the city commissioners actually can do themselves, or at least should do in consultation with the city solicitor about municipal races. And so that's something I'd like to see get done in the next 4 years. I think it's something we can be a leader on. I think people across the state don't understand why we elect judges the way we do, why we elect people for city council the way we do. And I think there are ways that city commissioners can do that unilaterally.
Yeah. So there's a bit of a sleeping crisis. I think I characterize it with our poll workers, and we're not the only county with this issue. And in fact, this is an issue across the United States. Our cohort of poll workers are aging, and it's and in Pennsylvania in particular, right? Our election infrastructure was set up generations ago. So what would you do differently there? I mean, as far as recruiting these folks, retaining these folks, preparing them, and then also making sure that they're actually ready to do the work on election day.
Right. So I think that's an extraordinarily heavy lift. And I think that when you talk about when you think about election security, on one hand, and sort of aging poll workers and sort of workers on the other hand, I think that is the type of thing that I think can be a recipe for disaster. So be really thoughtful, I think, from the moment the polling machines, the voting machines get picked. I think we've really got to think about how to train a populace of folks to do this and do this properly. And I think one thing that I really want to think about is how we fill vacancies in different ways. And I think we have to think really outside the box about how we fill vacancies in that office. One of the things I want to be doing is recruiting at colleges and law schools here, because I think there are people that are tech savvy, that will be relatively that shouldn't be moved one way or another by the fact that we probably don't pay poll workers enough, but folks that might be able to take a day because they've got flexible schedules and can step in and do the job. And I think on top of that, you're looking at, I think, a cohort of people in their 20s and 30s that don't replace the poll workers, because one of the having people that are in a community that have done it year after year is really helpful. People that understand the people that come to the polling place is really helpful. But to help supplement and to have, and I think to provide a little bit better of a backstop for some technological problems to go wrong, I think would be a good thing. And so thinking about how we can make sure those folks are sort of paired off, and that we have equal amounts of experience in any given polling site, but also people that are newer to the process but have some technical skills that might be helpful, I think is useful. The other thing I'd say is that we are trying to get people to invest in Philadelphia, and I think participating in sort of the democratic process here, I think makes it more likely that people will want to stick around, sort of become part of a fabric of the community. I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so we are just about out of time. I'll give you the last word here. What's the one thing that you think folks need to keep in mind before they walk into that voting booth next month?
On May 21st? Oh gosh. Great question. So I do think that this is the next 4 years are going to be a really big challenge for the city commissioner's office. I think you do want people that are competent, that are focused and passionate, and care a lot about this stuff, because we really can't afford to mess up. I think that the eyes of the nation are really going to be looking at Philadelphia for sort of how we run our elections in 2020. I think that Pennsylvania is going to be extremely close regardless of who the Democratic nominee is. And so that does mean that we really have to have, anytime you have to have a process that works for people. But I do think that, we don't want to sort of shoot ourselves in the foot by having people that we in the office that, are not qualified or are not prepared to do an absolutely great job.
We'll have to leave it there.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
All righty. So that's it from C70 with Kahlil Williams running for city commissioner. To get ready to vote next month, there are a ton of offices, a lot of candidates. 70's nonpartisan voter guide will be at ballot.70.org. That's ballot.70.org. You can also download our WeVote app, available wherever you download your apps at home. All the resources you could possibly need to be ready to cast an informed ballot. See you on election day, and thank you to Thomas Skelton Harrison for providing the funding for these broadcasts. See ya.